In April of 1857, a traveling cotton broker from Charleston made a discovery that would torment him until his death 3 decades later. While reviewing plantation ledgers at a modest estate known as Moss Creek in Middle Georgia, he noticed something unsettling hidden within the ordinary appearance of records. Over a span of 15 years, 23 male slaves had been sold from this property, each commanding a price significantly above market value, and each annotated with the same chilling phrase in the margin, "Prime condition certified." What the broker could not have realized at that moment was that those 2 words concealed a secret so disturbing that, once revealed, it had the potential to unravel the carefully guarded lies of some of Georgia's most powerful families. For decades, the truth would be buried under layers of silence, suppression, and deliberate destruction of evidence. Local authorities burned documents, silenced witnesses, and treated the matter as though it never existed. Yet some secrets resist burial, especially when they are recorded in meticulous detail by someone who understood that the sharpest weapon in an unjust society is not violence, but truth written clearly enough to survive the flames. The figure at the center of this secret was Eleanor Cresswell, a widow who inherited Moss Creek in 1840. Moss Creek was not one of the grand estates that defined the aristocracy of the antebellum South. There were no white, columned mansions, no sprawling gardens, and no famed social gatherings. It was a modest property of 370 acres set in the Georgia clay between the Oconee River and the county road that connected Milledgeville to Augusta. The main house was a simple two-story structure built from local timber, surrounded by 12 slave cabins, a cotton gin, a smokehouse, and a barn that locals sometimes remarked seemed unusually large for a plantation of that size. When Eleanor's husband Thomas died suddenly, his doctor attributing the cause to apoplexy, neighbors assumed the 31-year-old widow, childless according to public record, would sell the land and return to her family's respectable shipping business in Savannah. But she defied expectations. Instead of retreating to the city, she dismissed the overseer who had managed Moss Creek and assumed control of the property herself. Within a year, she had transformed the plantation from a struggling operation into one of the most profitable mid-size estates in the county. Her success was not based on conventional practices. While other planters built communities of enslaved families who worked the same land for generations, Eleanor followed a different, colder strategy. She called it strategic acquisition and disposal. She would purchase young male slaves between the ages of 18 and 25, keep them for 12 to 18 months, then sell them to planters in the expanding cotton frontiers of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. These territories were desperate for labor, and her men, carefully selected and well-fed, fetched high profits. The women at Moss Creek were few in number, no more than 6 or 7, and they were always older, past childbearing age. Eleanor deliberately chose women who could not reproduce, avoiding the complications of families, children, and generational attachments. She wanted efficiency, control, and profit, but she also wanted something more, a hidden agenda her neighbors could never have guessed. By 1845, Eleanor had earned a reputation as a shrewd businesswoman. Male planters who had initially refused to negotiate with a woman found themselves grudgingly impressed by her sharp knowledge of cotton yields, soil conditions, and market fluctuations. She remained aloof from social life, rarely appearing in church, never attending the dances or dinners that defined Southern womanhood. When criticized for this unwomanly independence, she would respond with a tight smile that never reached her eyes, explaining that widowhood had freed her from the burdens of pretense. Yet behind this mask of efficiency and independence, Eleanor concealed a darker reality. She kept 3 sets of books. The first, the one she allowed neighbors and tax officials to see, showed standard expenses and yields. The second, hidden but not impenetrable, recorded the true profits of Moss Creek, profits far higher than she admitted publicly. And the third ledger, kept in a locked iron box beneath the floorboards of her bedroom, written in a cipher of her own design, recorded everything. In those coded pages, Elinor documented names, physical descriptions, and the smallest details that might seem insignificant to anyone else. She noted the eye color, hair texture, skin tone under different light, and even the angles of noses and jaws. She was not simply recording sales. She was creating a genealogical catalog. The coded ledger became a tool not of business, but of vengeance. It was evidence she believed would someday expose the hypocrisy of Georgia's elite. Families who loudly defended the purity of their bloodlines while secretly fathering children with enslaved women. To Elinor, these men were not just laborers. They were living proof of lies embedded deep within Southern society. The routine at Moss Creek followed a chilling rhythm. Every time she purchased a new man, she isolated him from the others during his first week. The enslaved people knew what this meant but never spoke of it aloud, not even in whispers. On the seventh night, Elinor summoned the young man to the main house. The details of what happened behind those locked doors remained unspoken, but the enslaved women who worked in the house observed certain things. Elinor always bathed beforehand. She wore a specific plain gray dress. A lamp in her bedroom burned until late in the night. The young men who emerged the following morning seemed diminished, shoulders hunched, eyes cast downward, their movements heavier than before. And afterward, Elinor would spend long hours in her study with the iron box open, recording notes in her private ledger with the focus of a clerk preserving testimony. In the autumn of 1843, the first disappearance occurred. A man named Samuel, sold to a planter in Alabama for the remarkable price of $1,800, never arrived at his destination. The buyer complained, but Elinor provided impeccable documentation, a bill of sale, a receipt from the driver, a polite letter of concern. The matter was dismissed. Perhaps Samuel had escaped during transport, the buyer concluded. 6 months later, another man vanished under similar circumstances. Again, Elinor produced flawless paperwork. Again, the explanation of an escape sufficed. By 1847, 5 men had disappeared, yet no one saw the pattern. Buyers were spread across different states. Communication among planters was limited, and Elinor's reputation for honest dealing remained intact. But the truth was that none of those men had escaped. Their bodies lay buried in the rocky section of Moss Creek, where Elinor forbade her field hands from plowing, claiming she would one day plant an orchard there. The orchard never materialized. The graves remained hidden. Elinor's method was precise. After her ritual with each man, after recording his features in the coded ledger, she treated him well. She fattened him, ensured his health, and had a doctor certify his prime condition. She arranged sales to distant buyers and prepared transportation through intermediaries. But 3 days before the scheduled departure, she summoned the man to the barn after dark. That unusually large barn concealed a locked room. There, she offered the man whiskey laced with laudanum, enough to weaken him, not to render him unconscious. She showed him the ledger, explained the physical traits she had documented, revealed that he had been chosen not for his labor, but for the features he carried, features that connected him to powerful white families. And then, as the drug dulled his strength, she called for the only other person who knew the full extent of her plan. Her son, Henry Cresswell, would emerge from the shadows. Together, mother and son completed the work. Henry was never supposed to exist. According to public records, Elinor and her husband Thomas had no children. But in truth, Elinor had given birth at 27 years before her marriage, to the son of a man her family owned, a slave who worked the Savannah docks. The scandal was hidden, the child sent north to Philadelphia to be raised by Elinor's aunt. He grew up knowing the truth, his mother's identity, his father's fate, and the injustice of the system that had destroyed his family. When Elinor's husband died in 1840, Henry returned to Georgia under a new identity, Henry Lell, a traveling merchant. To outsiders, he was a respectable businessman. To Elinor, He was her son and her partner in a secret campaign of revenge. By 1850, 13 men lay in unmarked graves at Moss Creek. 13 sets of measurements filled Eleanor's coded ledger. 13 families stood unknowingly marked for future destruction. Yet Eleanor remained patient, convinced that her plan required decades of quiet, meticulous work. But history was moving toward conflict. National tensions over slavery mounted, and by the mid-1850s, Eleanor knew the time would soon come to act. What she did not know was that a single letter, carried from Boston by a man named Daniel Harrington, would bring her entire operation dangerously close to exposure. Daniel Harrington's arrival at Moss Creek was not the product of chance, but the result of whispers that had traveled through invisible channels, carried quietly from enslaved people to sympathetic ears, and then across hundreds of miles to Boston, where abolitionist networks waited eagerly for any hint of Southern cruelty to expose. When he stepped onto the plantation in September 1856, he was greeted by Eleanor Cresswell with the same carefully constructed mask she had worn for years, a modest widow's poise, a measured smile, and an aura of calm efficiency that disarmed suspicion. Harrington was a thin, angular man of 42, more scholar than farmer, with ink-stained hands and the air of someone more accustomed to courtrooms and libraries than to the suffocating Georgia heat. His dark northern suit clung awkwardly to him as he wiped sweat from his forehead, a detail Eleanor registered immediately, for she missed nothing about those who entered her domain. The parlor where she received him was deliberately unremarkable, with plain wooden furniture and a cleanliness that suggested order without luxury. She listened politely as he stated his purpose, that he had received communications alleging unusual circumstances in her plantation operations, most notably that she kept an all-male workforce who were sold after short intervals, and that several had vanished without reaching their buyers. Eleanor's response was composed and precise. He had been misinformed. She explained that she purchased men, invested in their health, and then sold them at profit, while her permanent labor force was a small group of older women who managed domestic tasks. As for the missing men, she could only assume they had escaped during transport, a fate common enough in the turbulent world of slavery. She even offered documentation, signed bills of sale, and medical certificates verifying prime condition. Harrington pressed her, revealing that he had 5 documented cases of men disappearing over 12 years, a statistic he found troubling. But Eleanor countered that he was seeing patterns because he wanted them to exist, that he had arrived determined to uncover cruelty and would interpret ordinary business as sinister. When Harrington asked if he might stay in the area, speak with neighbors, and even question her slaves, Eleanor remained unshaken, though her voice carried a warning disguised as civility. Georgia was not Boston, and outsiders asking intrusive questions were rarely welcomed. She left him with that truth, not as a threat but as a fact of the social order, and Harrington departed uneasy but undeterred. Over the following days, he pursued his investigation, visiting merchants, planters, and the doctor who examined Eleanor's slaves. Everywhere, he heard the same story. She was unusual, certainly, a woman running a plantation alone, but she was scrupulously honest in her dealings, an efficient widow who had rescued Moss Creek from failure. Nothing in their accounts suggested cruelty or conspiracy. Then, one night, a door opened that changed everything. A woman came to Harrington's boarding house after dark, an elderly slave who introduced herself as Ruth, a longtime house servant at Moss Creek. Nervous and frightened, she asked to speak in private, and once inside his room, she poured out a story in hushed tones, her gnarled hands twisting together, as though wringing out decades of silence. She spoke of the men Eleanor bought, of the strange 7th night when each was summoned to the big house, of the way they emerged the next morning, altered, broken, and silent. She spoke of Eleanor's long hours in her study with ledgers no one else could see, of the barn with its locked back room from which strange noises sometimes emerged at night. Noises that filled her with dread, though she could never describe them clearly. "She ain't right," Ruth whispered. "Been wrong since Mr. Thomas died. Maybe before, cold, like she plans things too much. And those young men she buys, they don't all get sold away, some just vanish." Harrington leaned forward, pressing for details, and Ruth told him about the plot of land Elinor forbade anyone to touch. Land she claimed she would plant with an orchard someday, but which had been dug and refilled more than once. She also mentioned the visits of a man known as Mr. Lell, supposedly a farm equipment merchant, who stayed for days at a time and held secret meetings with Elinor late into the night. Ruth stopped suddenly, realizing she had said too much, fear flashing in her eyes. If Elinor discovered her betrayal, she said, she would not survive. She rose to leave, her body trembling, but she left Harrington with a final plea. "Something evil's happening at Moss Creek, sir. Something that needs to stop." That night Harrington lay awake, shaken. Ruth's testimony was damning, yet he knew it would mean nothing in a Southern court. The word of a slave against a respected white widow was worthless. Still, he felt a duty to pursue the truth. The next morning, without sending word ahead, he rode back to Moss Creek, hoping to catch Elinor unprepared. She was in the yard supervising cotton bales, calm as ever, and welcomed him with an ease that unsettled him further. He asked for a full tour of the plantation, every building included. With a small flicker of calculation in her eyes, Elinor agreed. She showed him the gin, the cabins, the smoke house, everything neat, ordinary, unimpressive. When they reached the barn, Harrington pointed out the locked back room. Elinor explained it was only storage for broken tools and unused equipment. When he insisted, she produced a key and opened it. Inside, Harrington found exactly what she described: dust, cobwebs, rusted tools, and forgotten barrels. It looked unused for years. There was nothing to prove Ruth's story. Frustrated, Harrington walked away, but as he left he noticed the earth outside the barn was uneven, marked with subtle depressions as though dug and filled again. He thought of Ruth's orchard. Elinor quickly explained the land was poor, rocky, unsuitable for cotton, reserved for future planting. Harrington studied it but lacked evidence to press further. He returned to Milledgeville, frustrated and uncertain. For the next week, he spoke to anyone who would answer his questions, but no one confirmed Ruth's tale. Documentation was perfect, sales were legal, and disappearances could be explained as escape attempts. Without proof, Harrington was powerless. When he finally returned to Boston, he wrote an article for the Liberator, but lacking evidence, it appeared buried on an inside page and quickly faded from memory. For Elinor, however, the visit was a revelation of danger. Someone had spoken, someone had seen too much. She summoned Ruth to the big house, and with a gentleness more terrifying than rage, she explained that what was happening at Moss Creek was not madness but purpose. Unlocking her iron box, she showed Ruth the coded ledgers, the sketches, the measurements. She explained that every man she purchased was chosen because his features tied him to Georgia's elite families, proving their hypocrisy. The men were not murdered, she insisted coldly. They were preserved evidence, bodies that could not lie, bones that would one day destroy reputations and unravel Southern society's foundations. Ruth trembled, whispering that it was murder, that it was evil. But Elinor leaned closer, eyes like steel, declaring the true evil was slavery itself, a system that allowed powerful men to rape women they owned and disown their children. "I am not the monster," she said. "I am the reckoning." Ruth left that night carrying knowledge heavy as chains. She understood now that Moss Creek was not merely a plantation, but a tomb, and that Elinor's fight against injustice was built on blood. A campaign of vengeance that had already claimed 13 lives and showed no sign of stopping. Elinor and Henry's secret operation at Moss Creek deepened with every passing year, turning the plantation into a place where the rhythm of cotton cultivation disguised the quiet horror beneath. Unlike the sprawling estates of aristocratic families who invested in lineage and tradition, Moss Creek became a laboratory of vengeance where young men were studied, measured, and catalogued as though they were not human beings but specimens of evidence. Elinor had refined her selection process with chilling precision. She traveled to markets in Savannah, Augusta, and Milledgeville, moving among traders like any planter's widow, but her gaze lingered not on muscles, teeth, or the sheen of skin as other buyers did, but on facial structures and subtle genetic traits. She searched for noses shaped like those of the Rutledge family, for the gray-green eyes that marked the Caldwells, or the strong jawlines associated with the Pembertons. Every purchase was deliberate, and when she found what she sought, she paid whatever was necessary, knowing that the investment was not in labor but in bloodlines that could one day expose the hypocrisy of Georgia's most powerful families. Back at Moss Creek, each new arrival followed the same ritual. For a week, the young man was isolated from the others, treated with a formality that unsettled the enslaved community who knew, though dared not speak aloud, what the separation meant. On the seventh night, Elinor summoned him to the main house, bathed and dressed in a ritualistic gray gown, and behind the locked door of her bedroom some unspoken act occurred that left the man altered, diminished in posture and spirit when he emerged in the morning. The following day, Elinor would sit for hours with her iron box open, filling pages of her cipher with meticulous notes: hair texture under candlelight, eye color under sun, the curve of a smile, the length of fingers. For Elinor, this was not the record of a planter's transactions, but the construction of a weapon. She was documenting hypocrisy, creating a catalog that could destroy reputations and dynasties when released at the right moment. By 1850, 13 men had disappeared from Moss Creek, and the rocky field forbidden to slaves for plowing or planting had quietly filled with their bodies. These men were not simply vanished laborers, they were proof. To Elinor, living men could be moved, sold, silenced, or denied. Dead men, however, could not. Their bones, exhumed if necessary, would carry undeniable evidence of ancestry. Henry, returning to Georgia under the guise of a respectable merchant from Philadelphia, had become her indispensable accomplice. To the outside world he was Henry Lell, a supplier of farm equipment, but in truth he was Elinor's son, born in scandal to a Savannah dockworker enslaved by her father. That hidden parentage, carefully buried for decades, fueled his devotion to Elinor's crusade. While society believed him to be a business contact, Henry maintained a private chamber in the main house and a key to the barn cellar, where the grim work of cataloging evidence was carried out. His brief medical training gave him knowledge Elinor lacked. After each killing, Henry handled the bodies with clinical detachment, sketching anatomical details, measuring cranial structures, preserving hair samples, and sometimes extracting bones that displayed traits distinctive to elite family lines. To him, these were not men but exhibits in a case that would, one day, prove to the world that Georgia's ruling class lived by lies. Elinor's determination hardened as national tensions mounted. The Compromise of 1850 had momentarily slowed the conflict over slavery's expansion, but every planter sensed the peace was fragile. Rumors of sectional war spread like summer storms, and Elinor realized that the larger conflict she awaited might arrive sooner than expected. Still, she insisted on patience. 17 families were already documented in her coded books, but she believed she needed at least 25 to ignite the cascade of scandal she envisioned, where one family's exposure would lead inexorably to another until the entire fabric of Southern aristocracy unraveled. Henry urged caution. He feared that their work had already gone too far, that the graves in the orchard field, the coded ledgers, and the strange rhythms of Moss Creek had created vulnerabilities they could not control. He suggested that what they had gathered was enough to release, enough to discredit the purity of Georgia's elite bloodlines, but Elinor dismissed him. 17 names, she said, could be denied, suppressed, or discredited as forgeries. 25 would be undeniable. Her obsession with precision, with building a perfect archive of shame, pushed her further into darkness. It was in the summer of 1856, just as Eleanor calculated how to expand her collection, that a letter arrived from Boston, shattering the fragile safety she had constructed. The writer was Daniel Harrington, a lawyer and correspondent for The Liberator, an abolitionist paper known for publishing the cruelties of slavery. He announced his intention to visit Moss Creek to inquire about rumors of irregular practices, specifically the unusual turnover of male slaves and the suspicious disappearances of several who never reached their destinations. Eleanor read the letter 3 times without a flicker of expression. Then she summoned Henry. Someone had spoken, she said, her voice calm but edged with the understanding of betrayal. Henry, alarmed, asked if they should go silent, halt operations, and wait until the interest faded. Eleanor's lips curved into that tight, calculated smile that never warmed her eyes. "No," she replied, "we will invite him. We will show him precisely what he expects. A widow competently managing her plantation, nothing more. And then," she added, "we will discover who sent him and what he actually knows." Neither realized that this letter was not merely an inconvenience, but the signal of an approaching collapse. For the first time in 16 years, their secrets stood at the edge of exposure, and Moss Creek was about to become not just a site of hidden graves, but a stage where truth and lies clashed in ways Eleanor could no longer fully control. The murder of William Thorne in April 1857 marked the turning point in Eleanor and Henry's long, hidden campaign, for it was the first time they crossed a line that even they had never intended to cross, a line that separated their carefully constructed narrative of vengeance as justice from the simple, irredeemable crime of killing an innocent man who had done nothing more than notice what others had ignored. Thorne was a cotton broker from Charleston, meticulous in his habits, who had come to Moss Creek to review ledgers as part of his routine business dealings. Unlike most planters and brokers who glanced only at profits and production, Thorne examined every detail, and what he saw unsettled him. Slaves consistently sold for prices above market average, notations of prime condition certified, attached with suspicious regularity, and more troubling, the absence of follow-up records in which buyers should have documented the men's subsequent labor. To Thorne, these irregularities were not proof of crime but enough to raise curiosity, and curiosity in such matters was dangerous. Eleanor sensed immediately that he had seen too much. His casual comments, delivered without accusation, triggered a flash of fear across her face that she quickly suppressed. But Henry noticed it too. Thorne left intending to make discreet inquiries, perhaps to contact the planters who were supposedly his buyers, perhaps to verify that the men had ever reached their destinations. Eleanor watched his carriage disappear and knew with a cold clarity that her entire operation, 16 years of planning, secrecy, and blood, stood on the verge of exposure. That night she and Henry conferred in the main house. For the first time, Eleanor admitted to panic. Henry, always the more cautious of the two, suggested they release what they already had. 17 families documented, enough to discredit the myth of purity and to create scandal, even if not the cascade Eleanor envisioned. But Eleanor rejected the idea, insisting that 17 was too few, that the evidence would be denied, branded as forgeries, or destroyed before it reached the public consciousness. Only overwhelming proof, 25 families at least, would make suppression impossible. Her eyes hardened as she declared that there was only one solution. Thorne must be eliminated before he made inquiries, before he spread suspicion. Henry recoiled, pointing out that they had killed only slaves, men whose disappearances society ignored, men whose fates were assumed to be escape or resale. Killing a white man, especially one as respected as Thorne, was a different order of crime. The South would not dismiss it as easily. There would be investigations, manhunts, vengeance, but Eleanor's mind was already fixed. She explained with chilling logic that they would disguise the murder as the work of a runaway slave, a robbery gone wrong. Respectable widows were never suspects. The hunt would target a phantom fugitive, not them. Over the next 2 days, they refined the plan. Thorne stayed at the Milledgeville Hotel, where his habits were predictable. Each evening after dinner, he walked along the quiet road toward the river, alone, armed only with a small pistol more symbolic than useful. On April 23, as the sun set and shadows deepened along the road, a figure approached Thorne dressed in the coarse garments of a slave, face hidden beneath a slouched hat. Witnesses later recalled seeing them from a distance, 2 men in brief confrontation. The details emerged in the local paper. Thorne's pistol fired once. The shot went wild, and then he was struck repeatedly with a blunt object, later identified as a branch or piece of wood, until his skull fractured. He died within minutes. His money and watch were missing, but curiously his satchel of business papers remained untouched, an oddity dismissed in the panic of the moment. The attack was declared a robbery by a runaway slave, and within hours patrols scoured the countryside. Plantations were searched for missing men, patrols questioned slaves, and dogs were brought to follow non-existent trails. No fugitive was found. No plantation reported an escaped man. The investigation faltered, then grew cold, another violent death in a region accustomed to violence. What no one knew was that Thorne's killer had not fled at all. He had returned calmly to Moss Creek, washed away the blood in the hidden cellar beneath the barn, and emerged once more as Henry Lell, respectable northern merchant. While neighbors mourned Thorne, Henry sat in Eleanor's parlor discussing cotton prices with visitors, his composure flawless. Yet the murder changed something essential in both mother and son. For Eleanor, it was a necessary act of preservation, the price of continuing her campaign. But for Henry, it was the first time doubt began to crack his certainty. The slaves they had killed, he had convinced himself, were sacrifices in a larger war, evidence to dismantle the system that had enslaved his father and condemned him to live as a lie. But Thorne was different. He was no participant in that system's cruelties. He had merely noticed irregularities, and for that he had been slaughtered. Henry felt the weight of it in silence, withdrawing in the weeks that followed, helping his mother continue their work, but no longer with the same conviction. Eleanor sensed it, but pressed on. To her, hesitation was weakness, and weakness endangered everything. The true consequence of Thorne's death was not legal. Eleanor and Henry were never suspects, never questioned, but moral. It revealed that Eleanor had become exactly what she despised, a figure willing to destroy innocent lives to protect a system of her own making, a system of vengeance she had elevated to the level of justice. Moss Creek, already soaked in unmarked blood, now carried the weight of an atrocity that could never be excused as tactical necessity. In killing Thorne, Eleanor and Henry had not only preserved their secret but crossed irrevocably into darkness, where their campaign ceased to be about exposing hypocrisy and became about survival, power, and control. The reckoning Eleanor envisioned was no longer justice but obsession, and Moss Creek stood poised on the edge of collapse, waiting for history's tide to sweep away secrets too heavy to remain buried forever. The aftermath of Thorne's murder lingered at Moss Creek like a shadow that could not be shaken, altering the rhythm of life in ways Eleanor refused to admit but which Henry could no longer ignore. For the plantation's silence seemed heavier now, the air itself charged with guilt. Though no suspicions formally reached the Cresswell name, whispers drifted through Milledgeville and beyond, carried by merchants who recalled that Thorne's last business appointment had been with Eleanor. Some noted with curiosity that while his satchel of papers was left untouched, the man had spoken to colleagues of strange irregularities at Moss Creek only days before his death. But Eleanor faced such rumors with the calm confidence that had always shielded her. She entertained visitors, attended church with her usual composure, and donated generously to parish causes. the image of the benevolent widow untarnished. To Henry, however, her poise had begun to seem more mask than truth, a shield behind which something darker and more ruthless lived. He found himself haunted not by Thorne's death itself, but by the sound of his own footsteps as he walked away from the body, the smell of blood still on his hands, though he had scrubbed them raw in the cellar's basin. Nights at Moss Creek grew restless for him. He walked the orchard field where the hidden graves lay, staring at the uneven earth as though the ground itself condemned him. Ruth, the elderly house servant, observed his unease but said nothing, her silence a fragile balance between fear of Elinor and sympathy for Henry's conscience. Elinor, for her part, sensed his wavering but treated it as she treated all weakness, with calculation rather than compassion. She pressed him harder into their work, reminding him that they were not murderers but archivists, that what they had built was no less than a weapon to bring down the edifice of Southern hypocrisy. One death means nothing against centuries of oppression. She said one evening as they reviewed her ledgers, "Would you abandon your father's memory for pity on a broker who merely asked too many questions?" Henry nodded outwardly but inwardly recoiled. For in that moment he saw that Elinor had crossed into a realm where every act, however brutal, was justified by her vision of reckoning. Meanwhile, the political world outside Moss Creek grew turbulent. In 1857, the Dred Scott decision declared that African Americans, enslaved or free, had no rights under the Constitution, enraging the North and emboldening the South. Newspapers brimmed with fury and triumph, and talk of disunion thickened in taverns and parlors alike. For Elinor, this was proof that history was accelerating toward the confrontation she awaited. "When war comes," she told Henry, "our archive will be the stone that shatters their stained glass windows of purity." Yet Henry saw only danger, for if war erupted and Moss Creek's secrets were discovered amid the chaos, their careful work would be cast not as righteous exposure, but as monstrous murder. His doubts deepened further when another young man arrived at Moss Creek in June of that year, purchased in Augusta and fitting perfectly into Elinor's schema of resemblance to the Ashcroft family of Macon. Henry watched the process unfold as it always did: isolation, the seventh night summons, Elinor's cold ritual of intimacy, followed by her meticulous notes in the ciphered ledger. But to him, the young man's eyes afterward, hollow and broken, carried not just the weight of victimhood but of accusation. In those empty eyes Henry saw himself reflected, complicit in a system of cruelty disguised as justice. He began to avoid Elinor's study, to take longer trips into Milledgeville under pretense of trade, to spend nights in the hotel rather than the main house. He even considered abandoning Moss Creek altogether, but the bond of blood and the secret of his parentage chained him more tightly than any iron shackle. Elinor sensed his distance and responded not with anger but with persuasion, the kind of quiet, relentless argument that had always bent him back to her will. She spoke of the hypocrisy of families who raped enslaved women and discarded their children, of his own father's humiliation at the hands of white masters, of the child he himself had been, forced to hide his lineage. "This work," she insisted, "is your vindication as much as mine. Without it, you are nothing more than their discarded blood, forgotten in the dust." Henry listened but remained torn, his conscience a battlefield Elinor could not fully conquer. In the wider world, events pressed forward inexorably. Rumors of John Brown's activities in the North filtered south, frightening planters with the possibility of slave insurrection. Milledgeville's legislature passed stricter patrol laws, tightening control over enslaved bodies. Yet in every tightening noose, Henry saw a mirror of Moss Creek's own secret strangulation. He began to wonder if they were not, in truth, reflections of the very cruelty they claimed to expose. By the autumn of 1857, the orchard field contained 3 more graves, bringing the total to 16, and Elinor spoke with grim satisfaction of needing only 9 additional names to complete her arsenal. Yet Henry, standing over the uneven earth one moonlit night, could not shake the sense that the ground would not hold their secrets forever. He imagined the war Elinor longed for arriving not as vindication, but as reckoning of another kind, with Moss Creek itself dragged into the light as an emblem not of Southern hypocrisy, but of private horror. In those nights of restless wandering, Henry began to dream of betrayal, not of his mother, whom he still loved in some tortured way, but of the cause itself, of delivering their ledgers to someone who might use them without the blood-stained rituals that accompanied each entry. Still, he did nothing. Fear held him, loyalty bound him, and the inevitability of Elinor's will kept him in place. Thus Moss Creek drifted into 1,858, a plantation outwardly calm, inwardly cracking, its mistress blind to her own descent, her son trembling on the edge of defection, and the graves beneath the orchard swelling with the weight of secrets that could not remain buried forever. By 1,858, the hidden world of Moss Creek had become both fortress and prison, sustained by Elinor's iron will, yet corroded from within by the silent erosion of Henry's faith. For the plantation no longer thrived merely as a facade of cotton and commerce, but as a living archive of death where every new entry in ciphered ledgers added to the weight pressing upon their souls. Outwardly, Moss Creek appeared unchanged, fields planted and harvested, bales loaded and sold, accounts managed with precise order. Neighbors praised Elinor's efficiency and resilience, a widow who had preserved her estate without a husband's hand. But behind the locked doors and beneath the orchard's soil, a truth darker than any rumor grew restless. Henry, increasingly disturbed, began to spend hours away from the house, wandering the woods, riding into Milledgeville with errands that took longer than necessary, drinking more heavily than he once allowed. The image of William Thorne's broken body returned to him in flashes, not only when he closed his eyes at night, but even in the bright of day, a phantom shadowing his steps. Elinor, noticing his distraction, redoubled her persuasion, weaving words with the same skill she once used to manage planters and buyers. She reminded him of his father's humiliation, of her own disgrace as a young woman discarded by society, of the promise that their work was not cruelty, but vengeance sharpened into justice. The world will not forgive us for what we are, she told him one evening, but it will remember us for what we expose. Yet her certainty, once the anchor that steadied him, now seemed to Henry the voice of obsession rather than vision. He watched her hunched over her ledgers, eyes alight not with justice but with hunger, her hand scribbling notes on features and measurements with a fervor that frightened him. The more she pursued perfection in her archive, the less human she appeared, as though the cause itself had consumed her. Meanwhile, whispers beyond Moss Creek began to stir again. The abolitionist Daniel Harrington, though his earlier article had faded into obscurity, had not forgotten what Ruth told him. From Boston, he continued to correspond with contacts in the South, pressing for any further news of disappearances. Word reached him of William Thorne's sudden death, and though newspapers framed it as a runaway's violence, Harrington found the detail troubling. Thorne had been investigating irregularities at Moss Creek only days before. The coincidence gnawed at him, rekindling suspicion. He began drafting letters to associates in Washington, even considering a return to Georgia despite the risks. Elinor sensed, though she could not prove, that the Northern lawyer had not been silenced completely. Her instincts sharpened, she ordered Henry to maintain closer watch on visitors, to take note of questions that strayed too near their secrets. Henry complied outwardly, but inside his resistance grew. He began to confide cautiously in Ruth, whose quiet eyes seemed to understand what he could not say aloud. To her he hinted of doubts, of fear that Elinor's reckoning had transformed into something monstrous. Ruth listened but urged caution, for she knew Elinor's wrath better than anyone. "Your mother's not like other folk," she whispered once, "and if she thinks you're against her, she'll cut you out same as the rest." The warning chilled Henry, yet he could not suppress the thought that perhaps exposure was preferable to the slow suffocation of complicity. As the year advanced, history outside pressed harder upon them. The debates in Washington grew fiercer, the talk of secession louder. John Brown's failed attempt in Kansas, and the violence that followed rippled even into Georgia, where planters whispered of conspiracies and northern plots. For Eleanor, these events were confirmation that the storm she awaited was coming nearer. When the war begins, she told Henry, everything we have done will matter. But Henry wondered if by then it would matter only as evidence of madness. In August 1858, another young man was brought to Moss Creek, chosen for his resemblance to the Caldwell line, and Henry found himself unable to assist in the ritual. He feigned illness, locking himself in his room while Eleanor proceeded alone. He heard the muffled sounds through the walls, the measured footsteps, the closing door, the silence that followed, and afterward he could not bear to look at the young man's eyes, hollowed as though his soul had been taken. Something in Henry cracked that night, and for the first time he entertained the thought of turning against his mother. He imagined taking the ledgers, carrying them north, delivering them to Harrington or any abolitionist who would use them without the blood. But fear held him still, fear of Eleanor's control and fear of what would happen if her wrath turned upon him. The graves in the orchard now numbered 19, and the ground itself seemed to pulse with the weight of secrets. Ruth, in her cautious way, began to pray more loudly at night, her hymns drifting through the quarters as though to ward off evil. Henry, lying awake, found himself joining silently in those prayers, though not for redemption but for release. Moss Creek had become a crucible where vengeance burned hotter than justice, where the woman who once sought to expose hypocrisy had herself become a symbol of it. Eleanor could not see it, blinded by the fire of her mission, but Henry felt it with every breath, and he knew the reckoning she promised might yet come, not against Georgia's elites, but against Moss Creek itself, and against them both. By the spring of 1859, Moss Creek existed in a state of haunting stillness, suspended between illusion and collapse. Its silence broken only by the whisper of wind through the orchard, where the ground itself seemed alive with unspoken memory. Eleanor's health had begun to decline, though she denied it fiercely. Her hair, once a deep auburn, had turned iron, gray, and her eyes had sunk into hollows that reflected the sleepless intensity of her purpose. Yet her mind remained sharp, perhaps sharper than ever, its edges honed by paranoia, as she sensed that the world beyond her control was closing in. Rumors drifted south from Washington of heightened tensions, abolitionist plots, and whispers of rebellion. But the rumor that most unsettled her came not from the north, but from within her own county. Daniel Harrington was returning to Georgia. Letters intercepted through her contacts confirmed that the Boston lawyer had never truly abandoned his investigation, and now, armed with new leads and a personal conviction that Moss Creek held the proof he once lacked, he was coming back. When Henry brought her the news, her reaction was chillingly calm. "Then it begins," she said, as though she had been waiting for this confrontation all along. She instructed Henry to prepare the house for visitors, to ensure that every ledger was hidden in the cellar's false wall, and that the orchard field was left undisturbed. But Henry's spirit was no longer aligned with hers. He had come to view Harrington not as an enemy but as a potential savior, the one man who might end the nightmare without further blood. That night, while Eleanor worked by candlelight in her study, Henry rode secretly into Milledgeville, seeking out a contact who might reach Harrington before he reached Moss Creek. He left no note, no trace, but his absence by morning did not escape Eleanor's notice. She said nothing, choosing instead to wait, for she knew her son's conscience better than he did himself. She believed guilt would always drive him back, and she was right. Henry returned the next night, pale and shaken, muttering of a storm gathering on the horizon. The next morning, Harrington arrived. He was older, thinner, his face drawn but resolute. Eleanor received him in the same parlor where she had once greeted him 3 years before, the same polite smile frozen on her lips. He spoke with courtesy, but his tone carried the quiet authority of a man who had come not as a guest but as an accuser. He told her he had evidence of irregular slave transactions connected to her name, reports of men purchased and never delivered, and new testimonies suggesting that the orchard field concealed something unholy. Elinor listened without a flicker of emotion. "You are welcome to search," she said, her voice smooth, almost mocking. "I have nothing to hide." She led him across the grounds, explaining each building's function with meticulous detail, the same performance she had given years earlier. But Harrington, wiser now, noticed what he had missed before: the faint odor of lime near the barn, the fresh patches of earth too carefully leveled, the strange heaviness in the air. When they reached the orchard, he paused. The trees were young, their trunks slender, but the soil between them bore a subtle unevenness that drew his gaze. "It's beautiful land," he said quietly, and Elinor smiled, replying, "It's fertile ground. It remembers." That night, Harrington returned to Milledgeville to arrange for official warrants, leaving his assistant to watch the plantation discreetly. Elinor, aware that the mask had finally cracked, confronted Henry in the cellar. The flickering lamplight cast their faces in the half-shadow of betrayal. "You spoke to him," she said flatly, not as a question but as a certainty. Henry denied it at first, then, unable to meet her gaze, confessed. He told her he could no longer bear the burden, that their work had become madness, that every grave was a wound bleeding through his conscience. Elinor's expression did not change. "You think confession will cleanse you," she whispered. "You think they will forgive you because you helped them find me. They will hang you beside me, Henry. You are no innocent." Her words broke something inside him. For a moment he saw in her not the mother who had raised him, but the architect of his damnation, a woman so consumed by her vision that she would destroy even her own blood to preserve it. She ordered him to fetch the ledgers, but he refused. The argument escalated into shouts that echoed through the empty halls, and Ruth, listening from the corridor, began to pray aloud, her trembling voice rising with desperate intensity. Elinor turned on her, furious, but Henry stepped between them. "No more," he said, his voice shaking. "It ends tonight." Outside, thunder rolled, the first strike of an approaching storm. Elinor's face, pale in the candlelight, twisted with something that might have been sorrow or rage. "Then so be it," she said, and walked past him toward the door. That night, rain began to fall over Moss Creek, the first storm of the season, washing the orchard field and the graves beneath, as if the heavens themselves had chosen to bear witness to the reckoning that was finally descending upon them. The storm that broke over Moss Creek that night seemed almost conscious, as if nature itself had been waiting for the right moment to intervene in the long conspiracy of silence that had ruled the plantation for nearly 2 decades. Rain lashed against the windows with relentless fury. Thunder rolled over the hills like cannon fire, and lightning illuminated the orchard field in violent flashes, revealing the uneven mounds of earth that held the unspoken truth. Inside the house, chaos reigned between Elinor and Henry. Their argument, begun in the cellar, had moved upstairs, echoing through the corridors that once carried only whispers. Henry, desperate, pleaded with his mother to end it, to burn the ledgers, to surrender before Harrington returned with warrants. "We can still stop this," he cried, "before it becomes something even darker." But Elinor, her gray hair clinging to her face in the humidity, refused. "This is not something to stop," she said, her voice rising with a feverish conviction that bordered on madness. "This is the moment I was born for. They will dig and they will find, and when they do, the world will finally see what lies beneath their precious purity." Her words terrified Henry more than any threat could. She wanted discovery now. She was no longer protecting the secret, but orchestrating its unveiling as a final act of defiance. Downstairs, Ruth moved through the halls clutching a small crucifix, her prayers drowned beneath the storm. She had seen enough to know that no one would leave Moss Creek unchanged, if at all. When lightning struck the old magnolia tree in front of the house, the crack shook the entire foundation. In that blinding flash, Henry saw his mother not as the avenger she claimed to be, but as a woman hollowed by obsession, consumed by the ghosts she had summoned. He turned away from her, muttering that he would no longer be part of her madness. "You cannot leave," Elinor said softly, and when he turned back, she was holding the small pistol Thorne once carried, the one Henry had used to stage the murder 2 years before. For a long moment, neither spoke. The thunder outside seemed to pause, waiting. "If you go to him," she said, "you condemn us both. There will be no justice, only the gallows." Henry stepped forward slowly, his hands raised. "Then let there be gallows," he whispered. "At least they'll be honest." Eleanor's hand trembled, not from fear but from exhaustion, years of control collapsing into one unbearable instant. The pistol fired once, deafening in the confined room. Henry staggered back, eyes wide with disbelief, then fell against the stair rail as the candlelight flickered wildly. Eleanor stood frozen, the gun slipping from her hand. "Henry," she whispered, stepping toward him, but the word was meaningless now, swallowed by the sound of the storm. Blood spread slowly across the floorboards, dark and heavy. Ruth, hearing the shot, screamed and ran to him, kneeling beside his body, her cries mingling with the thunder. Eleanor backed away, her face expressionless, her mind already fracturing under the enormity of what she had done. She stumbled into the study, pulling open drawers, scattering papers, searching not for salvation but for control. She found the iron box, the archive of her vengeance, and dragged it toward the hearth. For a moment she stared at it, as though deciding whether to burn it or protect it. Then, with sudden clarity, she opened the box and began to toss the ledgers into the flames. The paper curled and blackened, the ciphered pages turning to ash as the storm outside howled louder, wind forcing open the shutters until rain swept across the room. Ruth, still crying over Henry's body, looked up and saw Eleanor standing before the fire, her face lit by the infernal glow. "Miss Eleanor," she cried, "please stop, the Lord will judge." But Eleanor only smiled faintly, whispering, "He already has." She reached into the fire, perhaps to retrieve something, perhaps to embrace it. The flames caught her sleeve, then her dress, and within moments the fabric ignited. Ruth screamed, rushing toward her, but Eleanor stepped back, her body already engulfed, her voice rising not in terror but in a strange, almost triumphant laughter that echoed through the house. The roof timbers groaned as lightning struck again, setting the upper floor ablaze. Ruth dragged Henry's body toward the door, coughing as smoke filled the hall. She stumbled into the rain, collapsing on the steps, gasping for breath as behind her the house that had hidden so many secrets became an inferno. The orchard field glowed in the stormlight, the fresh rain turning the soil to mud that seemed to move, as if the earth itself were exhaling after years of suffocation. From a distance, Harrington and his assistant, arriving with lanterns and horses splattered in mud, saw the flames rising above the trees. They spurred forward, but by the time they reached the house, it was too late. The roof collapsed inward, sending sparks high into the night sky. Ruth, soaked and trembling, tried to speak, but could only point toward the orchard. Harrington followed her gesture, his lantern trembling in his grasp. What he found there, beneath the surface of rain, softened soil, would later haunt him for the rest of his life. The bones of men buried in layers, arranged with care, each accompanied by fragments of burned fabric and iron tags bearing initials. The storm raged on, washing over the dead and the living alike, blurring the boundaries between justice and damnation until Moss Creek itself seemed to dissolve into legend. When the fire at Moss Creek finally burned itself into silence, the dawn that followed carried an uncanny stillness over the charred ruins, as though the earth itself hesitated to breathe. The great house was gone, reduced to smoking beams and blackened stone, but its ashes whispered of everything that had been hidden beneath its roof, the lies, the vengeance, and the madness that had consumed them all. Daniel Harrington stood amid the wreckage, his boots sinking into the wet ash, his face drawn with disbelief. Around him, townspeople and patrolmen moved in hushed confusion, unsure whether they were witnessing a tragedy or the unmasking of something far darker. Ruth, wrapped in a blanket and trembling beside a wagon, told what she could through tears. Her words came slowly, fragments of horror that painted only part of the truth. The arguments, the shot, the fire, the orchard. Harrington listened, but as her voice broke, he realized that even she could not comprehend the full weight of what had happened here. With local authorities assisting, he led a team to the orchard, where the storm had loosened the soil. As they dug, the horror emerged bone by bone. The remains of 21 men were unearthed over the next 2 days, many buried with eerie care, each accompanied by fragments of clothing or small personal items that had survived the flames. Some skulls bore marks of injury, others none at all. The community's reaction oscillated between disbelief and revulsion. For the neighboring planters, Eleanor Cresswell's fall from grace was an unspeakable scandal. A woman who had not only violated every law of decency, but had done so under their very eyes. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some called her a devil, others a madwoman. Still others whispered that she had been trying to expose secrets that should have remained buried. Harrington, examining the half-burned remnants of Eleanor's ledgers recovered from the fire, began to understand that she had not been entirely insane. The coded entries, once deciphered, revealed names and bloodlines, families whose reputations rested on the illusion of purity. Her notes, meticulous even in madness, traced physical features across generations, drawing connections between slave children and the very men who had sold their mothers. It was a record of hypocrisy so vast it staggered him. Yet whatever justice Eleanor had sought was lost in the method of her pursuit. Her cause, poisoned by blood, could never be separated from her crimes. Harrington made the decision to seal the ledgers and deliver them north, where they would be studied but never published. Truth, he told his assistant quietly, is not always liberation. Sometimes it's just ruin by another name. Ruth was taken into the town's care, but she never again spoke of what she had seen. She lived out her remaining years in quiet isolation, working in a small parish house, often found sitting outside at dusk staring toward the direction of Moss Creek, as if still listening for voices carried on the wind. The plantation itself was abandoned. The soil, once rich, refused to yield crops for years afterward, as though the land had absorbed too much of what lay beneath it. Travelers passing by claimed that on stormy nights the orchard glowed faintly, the air heavy with the scent of wet ash and something metallic, like blood washed into the earth. In time, the story of Eleanor Cresswell and Moss Creek became a local legend, retold in taverns and around hearth, each version more distorted than the last. Some said she was a witch, others that she had made a pact with the devil to avenge her father's sins, and still others that the spirits of the men she killed guarded the place, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to uncover the truth. By the time the Civil War erupted 2 years later, the ruins of Moss Creek were already overgrown, its orchard choked with vines and moss. Soldiers marching through Georgia camped near, by reported hearing voices in the rain, whispers that spoke their names, though none dared dig into the ground. Decades passed. The Cresswell name faded into obscurity, erased from polite histories, mentioned only in old newspapers and half-remembered gossip. But Daniel Harrington, long after returning to Boston, carried the memory with him. He published nothing more about Moss Creek, but kept one artifact locked in his study, the charred corner of a ledger page bearing Eleanor's handwriting, a single phrase still legible through the burn marks. Purity is a word men used to hide their crimes. On the night before his death in 1873, he was found at his desk, the fragment laid before him, his journal opened to a final entry that read, "There are truths so heavy the earth itself must bear them." In Georgia, the orchard still stood, silent beneath the weight of time. The graves had long been reclaimed by roots and weeds, but when the wind moved through the trees, it made a sound like breath rising from the soil, as if the land remembered every name that had been buried there. And so, the legend of Moss Creek endured, not as a tale of justice, nor of madness, but of the thin line between them, where one woman's obsession with truth became indistinguishable from the evil she sought to destroy.